over Walt Whitman and give you a sense of how he's an American poet and why he's a little bit different. Okay, he is different in one regard than the British poets who were writing at the same time. And that what we had over in England was Romanticism with poets like William Wordsworth, Blake, and others, and Shelley. They were writing in what would be probably recognized, I don't want to overgeneralize here at all, what we would generally be more comfortable with as poetry. They were taking on very important themes. They were writing about themes throughout time that everybody could, they were much more universal and much more recognizable as poets, okay? That was going on in the United States with the Puritans coming over. And as you know, they were a religious group from England. And you see that in the work of people like Anne Bradstreet. And let me show you her for a moment. And this is one of her poems called Before the Birth of One of Her Children. She's writing in the 1600s, in other words, in the 17th century. All things within this fading world hath end. Adversary doth still our joys attend. No ties so strong, no friends so dear and sweet, but the death's parting blow is sure to meet. Now, most people could, yeah, that's a poem. And it's taking on a theme connected to the birth of her first son, or the birth of her son. And yeah, it's very similar to what you would see in England. And another poet who was going on in the 19th century was Longfellow. This was here, let me go to him and give you a little bit of a sense of him. Again, we're not reading him. This is Arrow in the song. I shot an arrow into the air, it fell to earth I know not where. For so swiftly it flew, the sight could not follow its flight. And most people would say, yeah, that's poetry. Longfellow was, around the time of Whitman, considered to be the great American poet. He was the one whom everybody recognized as being the most talented speaking for the nation. But Whitman was writing and was often recognized. He had actually met Lincoln, and he was writing in a radically different way. And he was doing it from the very beginning. When he wrote Leaves of Grass, the first edition that came out in 1855, before the Civil War, he published it himself. And the whole notion of Leaves of Grass was leaves of a book, okay? Those are both, these are considered leaves, but also physically the leaves in the fields. And also the fact that this would be considered a common thing. In other words, I'm not going to talk about something glorified, dignified, and things like that. I'm going to talk about what's common amongst the people. He was really crafting himself as the poet of democracy. What America was doing was radically different than what was going on in the rest of Europe, which America is still identified with, in the rest of the world. This democracy, Whitman saw as embodying the equivalency of every person, that every person shared in this nation. And again, as I mentioned before, he really reached out to people who would have been marginalized in most societies, especially Europe at this time. Women, African Americans, obviously black citizens throughout Europe would have been marginalized. But he reached further. He was quite clear that he was homosexual. And so he reached out to other people and was not too shy about it. It was covered up in the decades after his death, but it was definitely there. It wasn't considered to be so radical in the time. It was not something you celebrated either, though. Let me show you the Song of Myself, which is how he started off his own poetry. And he starts this off. This is the 1892 version. This was his revision of it. I should mention about Leaves of Grass. That is his one book of poetry. He kept writing poems. He kept adding poems to Leaves of Grass as he went on, and he went back and revised the earlier ones. And so if you get the 1855 version of Leaves of Grass, it's actually going to be much smaller than if you get the 1892 one, and it's going to be different. He's going to change the poems. And he starts it off with, and this, consider Longfellow and Bradstreet. He starts it off with, I celebrate myself and I sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. Holy cow, that is radically different than what was going on in Europe or had been going on in America prior to this. He doesn't, this is not, it should not be confused with arrogance or narcissism or something like that. That would be misunderstanding it, like, understanding Muhammad Ali that way. Muhammad Ali, Walt Whitman, these were people who asserted themselves as they were. And they had been marginalized in various ways, especially, African Americans. Muhammad Ali saw his position as asserting an African American man doing something that should be admired. And Walt Whitman had been doing that in poetry a century before. That's essentially what he was doing. That's the analogy I would give you to understand Whitman. Don't confuse him with arrogance. Okay, that's a problem. We won't go into that, but it's assertiveness, not arrogance. Now, he did dabble in some European-style poetry. Let me show you. Most people, if you know anything about Whitman, you probably know "O Captain, My Captain." And I'll tell you this, I hate this poem, okay? "O Captain, my captain, our fearful trip is done, as the ship is weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won." This is so much like Longfellow, and no, this is not, Whitman would not be who Whitman is if it were for this type of poem, okay? In fact, he did later in his life denounce the fact that he had written this. He regretted it, okay? Let me jump over to his poetry so that the piece that I put up there, which is "When Lilacs Last and Dooryards Bloomed." Let's jump over there. And you're going to see something very different. And again, that's a picture of him as a mature man. I believe that's sometime in the 1860s, maybe. That's Dickinson, who, we're kind of morphing here. But Dickinson was a solitary poet. Whitman is going to be more assertive, and his poem that I'm using is "When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed." Understand, this is on the same exact theme as "O Captain, My Captain." It's on the passing of Lincoln. And Whitman was the ultimate Abraham Lincoln fanboy, had met him and everything else, and saw him as embodying the American ideal of freeing, putting an end to slavery, freeing African Americans, and getting the country realizing the goal of democracy in a very difficult way. And then he paid for it with his life. And he had this poem that he wrote. This one is undeniably one of the American great contributions to literature. I want you to experience the form of this, okay? "When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring. Ever-returning spring, Trinity, sure to me you bring, lilacs blooming perennial, and drooping star in the west, and thought of him I love." Now, walking through this, going through this bit by bit, "When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed," he's thinking back to when this very personal experience happened of the lilacs. Literally, he's writing about lilacs, and when they were in his dooryard. "And the great star early drooped in the western night." In other words, this western sky in the early great star, what he's doing here is kind of picking up on Lincoln. He's giving a bit of a metaphor, figurative language, as emblem of Lincoln as a star. And so something has gone down. "I mourned and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring." Now he's bringing in his mourning, his own emotional loss of this great figure. He does not directly name Lincoln. Very important. He does not name Lincoln directly. Everybody knows what he's writing about. The person everybody's being mourning is Lincoln. And notice that everybody at this time who would have read this poem would be contributing with their own emotional sense of what's going on. He's bringing the audience of his time into his poem with their emotions. He knows what they're feeling because he's feeling it too. And he's putting it in this image of this star drooping in the western sky. The west would have been where things would disappear and be gone. Okay, that's where the sun goes down on the west coast, not on the east. It goes down on the west coast, and that becomes, the personification, or he's personifying the loss through Lincoln, or I guess putting it in a metaphor of the star going down. Ever returning spring, Trinity sure to me you bring. And this notion of a Trinity is a Christian notion, okay? Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. But he's going to do this differently, okay? He's going to go through a Trinity that's different. He's bringing in this religious element because he's living in a Christian country and people would understand this. Whitman's own notions on religion are a little bit ambiguous to say the least, but he knows his audience would be aware of the Trinity. Lilac blooming perennial and drooping star in the west, and thought of him I love. Lilac, star, thought. Okay, that's the Trinity. Okay, the lilac blooming in his doorway year after year after year. The drooping star going down on the west. And then the thought of him I love, in other words, Lincoln. Okay, that's whom he's writing about. That's his Trinity as an American. O powerful western star, O shades of night, O moody, tearful night, O great star disappeared, O black murk that hides the star, O cruel hands that hold me powerless, O helpless soul of me, O harsh surrounding clouds that will not free my soul. And again, I want to be clear, he is breaking out of those conventions in a poetic manner, breaking out of the conventions of the rhyming clearly, of the clear, the structure of the lines with the accents and everything else, how the meter is throughout the lines. He is aware of the meter, okay? That's where the accents fall, but it's not going in a repetitive manner. What we saw from Longfellow and Bradstreet, and what you would have seen in the British poets writing at this time, is a repetitive, predictable manner. You're not getting that with Whitman. It's as if the line length cannot hold what he's writing about, his emotions over this loss, okay? In the dooryard fronting an old farmhouse near the whitewashed palings stands the lilac bush, tall growing with heart-shaped leaves of rich green, with many a pointed blossom, rising delicate, with the perfume strong I love, with every leaf a miracle, and with this bush in the dooryard, with delicate colored blossoms, the heart-shaped leaves of rich green, a sprig with its flower I break. What he does is he walks you through as he's coming out of his dooryard, and he walks you through him breaking a piece off. And this is a very personal action, not dramatic, but you can get a sense right here in stanza 3 of how he writes in a fluid manner. It is reading Whitman's poetry is much like reading prose. As you may know from Lincoln's assassination and what happened to him afterward, his coffin was sent on a train across the United States to Illinois, where he is from. And people lined the train tracks along the way to mourn him. Coffin that passes through lanes and streets, through day and night, with great cloud darkening the land, with the pomp of the interlooped flags, and the cities draped in black, the show of the states themselves, as of crape-veiled women standing, with processions, long and winding in the flambeaux of the night, with countless torches lit, with the silent sea of faces and unbared heads, with the waiting depot, the arriving coffin, and the somber faces. And again, there's so many metaphors to going through this, the silent sea of faces and the alliteration. And I really want to emphasize that this is not prose. It is highly crafted poetry but it gives the feel of prose, as if it can be read in a continuous manner. It's a radically different approach to poetry that you're experiencing with Whitman. Okay? With dirges through the night, with 1,000 voices rising strong and solemn, with all the mournful voices of the dirges poured around the coffin, the dim-lit churches, and the shuddering organs, where amid these you journey, and the you is Lincoln. Okay, he's talking to the coffin and to the president he's lost. With the tolling bells, perpetual clang, here coffin that slowly passes, I give you my spring of lilac. That joins it from here, from this moment of very personal, walking out of the dooryard, to this public moment he's taking part in. He's just placing that on the coffin. Okay, that is how he is crafting the poem throughout. He will join things together in a very delicate manner. And I want you to be aware with reading Whitman, as you read him through, you can go into him and kind of get sucked into him, and he's almost like reading, regular prose. But be very aware. This is poetry, and it's very carefully crafted. And the elements, the themes, the images that come up in one place, they're probably going to be brought up in another place, not to repeat, but to change and to give a nuance to something that he talked about earlier.